First things first, if you're unfamiliar with us, we like to do a quick recap of the episode before we dive into our proper discussion and theory crafting and, deep dive. So yeah, I guess we could just jump into that now, unless there's something else you wanted to tap
Well,
into
if you're
before.
if you're watching just the recap and you want to see our full thoughts, just down in the episode description, you'll see the link to this whole episode. Everyone else who's here for the whole conversation, it's glad to have you. And thanks so much for commenting, telling us what you think. We love engaging with you
We
after
do.
the fact as well. So, yeah, let's talk about what happened on this week's episode of Critical Role C3E3. Dun 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 dun.
That's right. Alrighty. Well, I'll start us off. So, the episode picked up right where we left off last time, with Orem kind of hilariously prodding around in the dark of this
Yeah.
warehouse at Prudage Textiles, and everyone kind of messing with them for the little Halloween vibes. But yeah, so we pick up with him still kind of looking around here. Meanwhile, we've got two sets of the party at the front of the warehouse and at the back of the warehouse, kind of waiting for what's next. And at the front of the warehouse, we have Bertrand and Imogen and Dorian and Danas, who has just exited. The Bertrand and Imogen are like, wait, she looks fishy. We got to follow her. So they dart off. Dorian's like, I'm not leaving Orem, so he stays. Um, so we'll start with this kind of chase sequence that we have here. So Imogen and Bertrand are trying to stealthily follow Danas through the city as she's kind of darting to and fro. And they split up to be a little less conspicuous, Bertrand and Imogen. And unfortunately, Danas spots Imogen and walks up to her. And
I don't
is
think there was a
kinda-
single good role in this entire process, by the way.
no,
It was not surprising that she was caught.
yeah, she was not being very stealthy. So Danas approaches her and is like, we're closed. What are you doing? And Imogen does make a deception check and is basically able to successfully kind of get Danas off of her. And she's just saying, oh, I just happened to be here. And she picks up that Danas is acting pretty kind of sketchy, anxious, nervous. So Imogen,
Skittish,
yeah, skittish. Thank you. Imogen's like, hey, do you need any help? You want me to walk with you? And she's like, no, I'm fine. Like, I'll see you later if you're gonna, come back to the warehouse or whatever. So they split ways, and at this point, Imogen's telepathically communicating with Bertrand and is like, hey, like she's seen me, so like I'm gonna back off. You need to be the one to like keep a tail on her now. And Bertrand is kind of hilariously throughout this whole sequence, like since Imogen told him to telepathically communicate with her while they're doing this, he's like giving her every single direction he takes. I'm like, I'm taking a left, I'm taking a right. It's pretty funny, but so he continues to follow her, and she ultimately darts into the Weary Way Tavern, and he follows her inside. Um, Imogen does not come inside because she's still worried that there might be a little too obvious if Danas sees her again. So Imogen kind of goes around back, makes sure Danas didn't like slip out that way, but she doesn't see her. And Bertrand actually doesn't see her inside the tavern either. So he's like, "Hey, just come inside. We got to figure out what we're doing here." So Imogen makes her way inside. They begin to talk a little bit. They're like, "Well, I guess we could go back to the warehouse." Since we kind of lost the lead. But at that moment, Bertrand actually does spy someone that looks like Danas across the tavern. He's like, wait, I think I see her. And so Imogen and Bertrand are trying to be inconspicuous again as they try to get closer, but they kind of lose track of her.
Flail their arms like a windmill
Yeah,
because they
they're
think she
like,
might be invisible.
yeah, they're
And
like,
maybe we
they
can
might
hit
be
her.
invisible, so just like
Yeah,
see if you can find her.
yeah. This is pretty much a train wreck when it comes to like subtlety and deception. I mean,
Yes,
it was pretty funny to
they are
watch.
crashing and burning.
Yeah.
But so they ultimately lose track of her, and they decide, well, okay, we know she came here, but we have no leads at this point, so let's head back to the warehouse, kind of tell everybody else what's up and what we found here. So meanwhile, back at the warehouse, everyone everyone else has been debating what they should do because they haven't heard from Orem. So Laudna decides to go check the full frontal crew, and she finds Dorian, who's now by himself since Bertrand and Imogen left. And she's like, he fills her in on what happened, and she's like, "Well, just come back to the back with us. You shouldn't be alone." And they begin, debating and plotting for like an hour in real time on what to do. And ultimately, they're like, let's just message Orem and tell him to open the door for us.
Yeah.
So,
And what's funny about this too is my wife at this point was like, so like, what are they doing? And like right at that point, in-game fresh cut grass, and Lauden are like, what are we doing
Yeah.
exactly? Like, what is our plan? And I was like, yeah, see, like, I'm not the only one who has no idea what's going on here.
Again, yeah, it's a very critical role to just be stuck in a planning phase for forever. But so yeah, they ultimately are like, oh wait, we can message Orem. So Laudna message Orem, tell him to open the door for us. And so he tries the back door, but again, it is sealed shut, so he cannot open that. So they're like, all right, front door. And he goes and tries to open the front door, but he can't do it from his side. So he's like, y'all are gonna have to open it from your side. And so Laudna, with a combination of her just trying to brute strength it and then ultimately just lock picking it, is able to get the front door open, and they go inside. And around about now is when Bertrand and Imogen return from the Weary Way Inn, and basically everyone gets caught up to speed. Bertrand says, I'll wait outside, keep an eye out if you guys all, want to go in and investigate. So he does that. Everyone goes in. They're looking around. It is pitch black in there, but Dorian has his moon touch scimitar, which kind of gives some light. But then Fern ultimately casts, I think it's Fern, dancing lights, which illuminates everything.
Imogen.
Oh, it's
Yeah,
Imogen.
Imogen.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense. But so Orm ultimately finds like a locked office, and he slices it open, and they go inside and do some investigating there, and they are ultimately able to find some papers that detail like the business and the ledger of this warehouse. And with some keen investigation, they were able to discern that there has been some adjustments made here. Someone has like scribbled over numbers and replaced them with other numbers to seemingly mask the fact that there's been some theft happening.
Right.
And after some handwriting comparison, they are able to determine that this is Danas who has been altering these documents. So they're like, all right, should we take this to Esteros, or do we need to investigate further? And they ultimately decide that let's not take this to him yet. Let's see if we can find out more from Danas before we go talk to Esteros. So they see if they can find her address, but they can't. And so the only lead they have is the Weird Way Tavern. So the group decides to head back there, and when they arrive, it's busy tavern. Dorian decides to go bribe the musicians since he's one himself, thinking he could get in with them, and finds out through them that they have seen someone that matches Danas's description walk upstairs a few minutes
Right.
prior. So most of the group heads upstairs. Bertrand stays down to keep watch. And FCG decides to use his ability to detect thoughts upstairs to be able to probe in through these closed doors. It's basically a long hallway with a bunch of doors.
Right.
So he's going to detect thoughts to see if he can hear, who's in here. Maybe he can find Danas that way. So he does just that, and there is one room that pings very loudly for him. There's about 9 or 10 thinking creatures on the other side of the door, one of which he recognizes to be Danas. So he's like, "Hey, I think they're in here." And so Orem kind of gets up close to the door and listens to see what he can hear, and he hears some hushed whispers, and it's kind of like an ominous sounding conversation. They're basically scolding Danas for being like, "Oh, so you've messed up. Like people are onto us." And
Right.
the conversation ultimately ends with, "Well, your services are no longer required." Seemingly like a threat, and they're about to take Danas out. So Orm's like, "We got to get in here." And so Orem, Ashton, they all just start trying to bust down the
Yeah.
door. Uh,
Fern knocks.
yeah, Fern's
Fern
like, "Room
Knox says
service."
housekeeping. Yeah, yeah. The bad rolls continue because they cannot seem to get through this simple door.
Yeah, doors, if you've watched the previous campaigns, doors are like the big bad for all of Critical Role's
Okay, that's funny.
campaigns.
Okay.
So, yeah, so they
Yeah.
bust through the door trying to help Danas from this, seemingly dire situation. And they bust through, and immediately they don't see anything. It's like weirdly um an absent. They don't see Danas, they don't see anyone else. It's just dark. So they kind of probe in a little bit further, and from the far corner, they kind of see this like sallow dwarf, like kind of emerge from the far corner, and he's like, "Oh, I wasn't expecting um, more visitors."
Right.
And so basically, boom, we're rolling an initiative, and everyone begins to kind of attack this mysterious dwarf, who's got like this rapier and dagger, and he's proving pretty formidable. He actually like lays out some damage on Orem, and as everyone's attacking him, he is eventually is like, come, my children, and all of a sudden, everyone hears like this skittering, and these little creatures, I think described as creepers, kind of emerge.
Shade creepers.
Shade creepers, thank you.
Yeah, and they said they were kind of like almost goblin-esque, sort of like the vermin of Drusar.
Yes, and they were described as like they have these claws and leathery faces with no noses, and they're just crawling out from like under the closet, under the bed, like out of the shadows. And I think there's 9 in total, and so they all begin attacking the party as well. So basically, there's this big combat going on. Um, they're trying to take out the creepers. They're trying to deal with the dwarf. But at one point, the dwarf casts this like magical darkness, and the room gets even darker. The lights dim, and he is kind of fully obfuscated in this supernatural darkness. Um, and most of our party cannot see except Fern. She turns into a snake with her wild shape, who has blind sight. So she's kind of probing in there, trying to find him, while everyone else is kind of blindly attacking or trying to attack the creepers that they can see. And ultimately, the dwarf has disappeared. Fern, even with her snake sight, is unable to find him. So the party manages to take out the rest of the creepers, but like I mentioned, Bertrand was downstairs keeping watch. When he heard this ruckus going on, he ran up. So he runs up during the middle of this, and like I said, there's this magical darkness. So he runs in and attacks, and accidentally attacks Dorian, who then just backhands
Yeah.
him in retribution.
I love how Matt said like even like the creepers and everyone like was like, oh, like
Yeah.
this out of character moment of like the slap heard around the world.
Yeah, it was great. And then I think Travis even gave him advantage on it because like his first roll was bad. He's like, no, 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 I give you advantage, and
Yeah,
so he backhands him. But anyway, so the party finishes off all the remaining creepers, and they're unable to find this dwarf. But combat has seemingly ended, and they kind of just find themselves sitting in this hotel room. And
Mhm.
you want to take it from there?
Yeah, sure. And great job, by the way. I mean, this was definitely a formidable opponent, and like the 4 attacks on Orem, who's been kind of like a understandable tank, I guess, of the group,
Yeah,
getting basically downed. I mean, that was pretty incredible.
yeah,
But yeah, so the fight initiative ends. Imogen actually goes into the bedroom on the backside of the suite and finds a balcony. She looks out, doesn't see anybody out in the back alley. And through some investigation, she does find this under like a dresser, like a nightstand, this piece of wood that's kind of creeping out or flanked out a little bit. And she peels it back and finds this really small, tiny hole, and even asks Orem like, "Hey, do you think you could fit down there?" And they're like maybe now's not the right time. And actually, as they continue to look, the darkness is still there but subsiding. They do find what feels like a boot under the main table in the room they first came in,
yeah,
and they find out that this is Danis, who is underneath it and dead. And Fresh Cut Grass tries to cast Spare the Dying, but it's too late. Danis has been, her throat's been slit literally from ear to ear. And she's dead. And so then they're talking about like, what do we do? And they can actually hear footsteps coming up down the hallway, and they start to panic, realizing like, oh, like we've caused a large commotion. Like, what do we do?
yeah,
So they all start talking about like, let's jump off the balcony, like let's just get out of here. And they're like, people saw us here, like we can't just like leave a body, or else we're gonna have like there's gonna be an implication about us, being involved in this. And so it turns out they're like the bodyguards of the place. They knock on the door, and Imogen like undoes a button of her blouse and like grabs Dorian and is like, sorry, are we being noisy? And they're like, yeah, if you'll keep it down. But basically convinces them that they were just fooling around, basically.
yeah,
So they lose them. Party talks some more, and they're like, okay, we at least have enough to take to Esteros. And in kind of a dark humor-esque way, Ashton wraps up Danis and then ties the wrapping. Remember, it's a gnome. Ties the wrapping to his glass hammer, almost like a hobo stick, and it's kind of like,
yeah,
but very clever. And so they basically go out the balcony, or they leave, and they make their way back to Esteros's place with the ledger in hand and with Danis's body. So they get there, and it's actually the atmosphere. They're informed that Esteros is in the dining hall, and the atmosphere is very different than the first time they came here. There's this warm vibe in the place. It's still not well lit, but there's like this fruity baked smell that's like permeated the entire place. And they go into the dining hall to see basically a a placemat, or like a serving mat for each of them placed out. And they begin to tell Esteros about what they found. They put the body on the table, and he's very perplexed by this, especially the description of the dwarf that they encountered, and the broomstone. It really throws him. He's like, okay, this actually doesn't sound like the Ivory Syndicate, which is what I was expecting originally. And this character you're describing doesn't match anyone that I would come to understand.
Yeah.
But still, the mission has been mostly successful. They've stopped the person who was basically stealing from him, and so he's like, well, let's at least celebrate. And he leaves and comes back with this very ugly baked carrot cake. And everyone's kind of like, oh, like, did your head of the house make this? And he's like, no, I baked it.
I made it.
Yeah, and he's very proud. I really enjoyed this portrayal of Esteros because he's totally different.
Me too.
He's not like the brooding, dark, mysterious. He's like this very amicable, friendly, warm, and very proud of his baking skills, by the way. And so everyone has a slice, and they're like, hey, actually, it tastes pretty good. And he basically says, we don't need Danis's family to know about sort of her underdealings, but definitely you've all been successful. And so they drop all the gold in front of them and says, we can formally work together now, like you've proven your worth. And we'll get a formal contract written up in the morning. And does ask them, by the way, like, what is your party's name? And as we've seen in previous content, they can't really figure out what they want to call it.
Yeah.
But so they eat and they talk and they socialize. And a couple of quick, interesting details from this conversation is they do ask Esteros more about his backstory. And he basically says that for 20 plus years, he was a mercenary in Marquette. He was part of a group called the Bloody Hilt, and he made a name for himself. He was actually very good at it until he came across a person who became essentially a best friend to him, Lady Mistress Prudage. Is that right? The former owner of the house, who we had found out had basically left everything to him when she passed, and said that he basically became a bodyguard for her, was like a best friend to her, and then she basically died of natural causes. Which, by the way, Laudna does an insight check, and we get another table whisper. Something gets communicated between Matt and Marisha, which Laudna then says after the fact, how tragic, almost sarcastically. So something more is happening there. We also get another detail of Fresh Cut Grass asking about Esteros's former adventures and saying, have you heard of anything about a one-eyed monster who may have been responsible for, all of my friends being dead? And despite this questioning, they really don't land on anything. Esteros says, I've heard of Cyclopses, but really nothing that you're referring to. Right. I mean, there's plenty of creatures that could have been responsible for that. Anyway, all this being said, Bertrand's incredibly excited about this contract. He's like, yes, like finally, like I'm back baby.
On top.
yeah. And even Esteros, in seeing him kind of brag and gloat a little bit, even has a moment of like, like, good job, Bertrand, like, well done. All this to say, the party decides, we'll meet back in the morning. They head out. They go to the Spire by Fire. There's a little bit of small talk, and ultimately the party celebrates. Bertrand buys everyone around. He even buys drinks for other patrons in the bar.
Yeah.
And one by one, the party decides to call it a night. And so Ashton and Fresh Cut Grass make their way back to the Crook House. Was the apartment owner, was it Milo? Is that right?
Milo is their name from the Crook House. I don't really know if he's like the landlord or what, but
right. So Ashton actually goes to Milo's room and hands Milo the gold that he acquired earlier, and says basically, hey, find out everything you can on Lord Esteros.
Mm,
And he actually also has Fresh Cuts Grass Cut, who we did mention it earlier, but the two of them were talking, and Ashton admits that the reason he's so interested in acquiring gold is because he has some very sizable debts against him that
right.
he just
Thank
wants
you.
to be free of.
I forgot to mention that.
So Milo gives some of the gold back to him and says, I only need just a little bit, but I will find out everything I can find out about Lord Esteros. Lord Esteros. Meanwhile, Orem and Fern call tonight. Orem turns to Dorian and basically says, hey, make sure the old man makes it back to his room in one piece. And Dorian's like, yeah, of course. And so it's basically just left to Dorian and Bertrand. And Bertrand, it's very this whole conversation, if you've watched any movie ever, you're kind of like, this is very, I got some bad vibes happening here, because Bertrand is like talking about the joy of being young and being like, don't take it for granted, to
Right.
Dorian, saying like, I'm gonna stay up all night and see the sunrise. I haven't done that in years. And Travis acted this very well. I mean, it's just,
Yeah.
you can definitely feel the positive energy from Bertrand. And meanwhile, Imogen and Lana have headed back to the windowed wall, which is where they're going to meet in the morning. And of course, Bertrand, being the charlatan that he is like, yeah, of course I know where that is. And
Yeah.
so when it's just Dorian and Bertrand, Bertrand's like, well, I'm going to head out and try to find the windowed wall because I have no idea where it is. And he also says, I have no idea where this library, the Starpoint Conservatory, is either.
Yeah.
And Dorian's like, are you sure, like, going out alone? And he's like, no, yeah, I'm sure. I want to like let an old man, have his walk.
Yeah.
And he's like, okay. So Bertrand pieces out, walks off by himself, and also like starts throwing money out to other patrons, like very excited about this contract. And so as he's walking, we cut back to Imogen, who is asleep, and she's having this dream sequence of, it seems to be maybe her home, her original home. It's this
Yeah.
lush
Something like
pasture.
that.
It's her horses there named Flora, I think is what the name was.
Yeah.
She's feeding the horse. She has like her cottage there, and had kind of like a cowboy-esque vibe. But while that dream's happening, Bertrand is walking and he decides to relieve himself in an alleyway. As this happens, a figure steps into the alleyway and basically says, let's have a conversation deeper in. And he says, no, I don't think I will. And then the person basically stabs him, and you realize it is the dwarf from earlier, and does a couple of attacks on him and just pushes the rapier through him. Bertrand falls back. The figure steps over him and says, Sir Bertrand Bell, and says good night to him. And meanwhile, the set turns bright red. It's back in Imogen's dream sequence, and Matt begins to describe this tempestuous storm that is rushing in on this pasture. And Imogen turns to run back to her cottage. Flora scampers off, and as she makes it to her cottage and swings open the door, she looks back and sees a old refined man, Bertrand, walking face first into the storm. And that is where the episode ends, and that's what happened in this week's Critical Role.
Hell of a ending sequence.
Oh my gosh, man! Yeah, I know. It's wild and crazy. So